Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the first GSF event, not just of September, but of our 2021 series. When we planned this event in the early summer, we chose today because we knew that international forces led by the US would have left Afghanistan at the end of August, and that seemed a good thing to talk about. What, of course, we didn't know is how the summer would turn out. We didn't anticipate the Taliban would be back in control some thousands of lives and $2 trillion later after a very hard 20-year campaign. So we really do have an awful lot to talk about today. I would like to introduce you to our expert panel, and I will give you shorter introductions in a moment. But we're delighted to welcome today Christina Lamb, who is in Kabul, if the technology holds up, Tamim Asey, who is in quarantine in the UK, and Sir Nicholas Kay, well known, I think, to many of you as a very senior UK Afghan hand. Some of you may have spotted that I'm not Michael Lothian. My name is Richard Barrons. I'm a GSF Advisory Board member, and I am deputising as your chairman today. Before we kick off, I've got a couple of parish notices to read to you. The first is there will be a second GSF Afghanistan event later this month on Friday, the 24th of September, when His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will be talking to Sir Malcolm Rifkind, and the subject will be his new book called The Afghanistan File, published this week. The invitations to that event will be sent out shortly. It will also be a webinar. Secondly, as we look at this new series of GSF events, we want to try to get back in October to in-person events. In fact, I think we're going to explore a hybrid model, but it would be very good to see people back here in the National Liberal Club, not least because that's the only way we're ever going to get back to our favourite sausages on sticks. Turning to today's event, which is a view-only webinar, I need to talk about how you're going to ask questions. Plan A is that you type your question into the Q&A function on your screen, and then if you catch the selector's eye, who is Jacqueline, I will ask you to unmute, which of course is quite important to the process, and then invite you to raise your question. That is the preferred way that we would like to proceed today. Plan B is that you type read in front of your question, and then it'll appear on a screen in front of me, and I will try and do it justice by reading it out. And plan C is the technology collapses completely, and I will then provoke the panel on your behalf for the balance of the hour till 2 o'clock. We are recording today's event, and there are two ways you can access this. That you can find it later on our YouTube channel, which is on the website in lowercase globalstrategyforum.org. And you can find it on Twitter under the GSS account, which is hashtag GSF Events Day. And I know for some of you, this is where having grandchildren has become quite important. Let me now introduce you to our panel. Christina Lamb, I don't think needs any introduction to most of you. She is now the chief correspondent, the chief foreign correspondent of the Sunday Times, and the author of many books, including recently Farewell Kabul, From Afghanistan to a More Dangerous World. She's in Kabul now, unlike all the armed forces of the Western world, and probably starting her next book, which is Hello Kabul, It's Not Getting Any Better. Second up, we'll have Tamim Asey, who is a former Deputy Minister for Policy and Strategy in the Ministry of Defense of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. He is a distinguished scholar and founder and executive chairman of the Institute of War and Peace Studies. He's just been evacuated from Afghanistan, a tale to be told there. As I said earlier, currently in a slightly grim hotel somewhere in quarantine. And finally, Sir Nicholas Kay on my left here in the room. Nick is one of those rare characters who is a genuine UK Afghan hand. I think must have spent 5 years at least of his life in that country. He was the NATO senior civilian rep, effectively the ambassador of NATO to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan from 2019 to 2020. And before that, he was the UK ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, just a few hundred yards away on the other side of downtown Kabul from 2017 to 2019. The title of our discussion today is the 20 years since 9/11, the Afghanistan crisis, what now? Clearly a very major and timely question. And before turning to the panel, let me just try and frame the discussion that we are trying to have, because I think, as many people are aware, the blame game is alive and well now about how things have turned out. There's clearly profound disquiet in many quarters. This is coloured by imperfect recollection and near perfect hindsight in the heat of the moment. But I think there are probably four areas that we need to consider. First of all, right now, many of us have colleagues who we said we would get out, and we have left them behind. We need to resolve that. Secondly, we can see unfolding in Afghanistan in the wake of the collapse of the economy and the institutions of government, a humanitarian crisis, and winter is just a couple of months away. And thirdly, despite the reasons we went to Afghanistan originally, the very real risk of terrorism taking root again and bringing harm even to us here in the UK. So that's here and now. Secondly, we might ask, well, what happens next in Afghanistan? What will the Taliban actually do? Beginning to see some signs of that. How will the region respond? Are they going to support or hinder whatever now unfolds in Afghanistan? And of course, what does the West now do in our own hard national interests to find a way of unpicking the security and other issues that we still have in Afghanistan and its region? Thirdly, perhaps not for today so much, but where does this outcome leave Western interests? It has raised profound question marks about our will and our actual capability to stand up for our interests, our values, and the commitments that we have made. And that question is being asked not just by us, but also by many in Africa and Asia and the Middle East, who will wonder just what sort of fair weather friend are we, and would they indeed be better to align themselves with Russian or Chinese interests, where the money seems to come in larger quantities and the constraints rather less. That cannot be easy for us to consider. And we should recognize in that context that just a few months ago in the integrated review, our government set out how the world that we are going to live in is much more challenging, multipolar, darker, presenting real risks for our security and our prosperity. And yet, in the case of Afghanistan, in the eyes of many, we've gone home with our tail between our legs when it all got too difficult. And fourth, perhaps for the military and the diplomatic audience in particular, there's a 20-year campaign here which has some very profound lessons, some of which will be easier to talk about now the campaign is over. We struggled against an insurgency that clearly had popular support or acquiescence with many Afghans, despite everything we tried to do. It had a safe haven in Pakistan that we found we couldn't tackle, and that made it extraordinarily resilient. We found we were partnered with an Afghan government for 20 years, which seemed to really struggle to improve, definitely struggled to improve its reputation in the eyes of its own citizens. And some of its members, not all by any means, some of its members stole our money and continued to live off the fruits of opium. So our choice of partner was a mixed blessing. We applied a template called nation building for development, which doesn't seem to have left much of a physical legacy, but it has cost billions of dollars, principally American dollars, and all the lessons to be learnt there about what works and what doesn't work. We spent a fortune building many times over military and police forces. We tipped people and equipment and money into a bucket, and from the bottom of the bucket leached a lot of people, a lot of money, and a lot of equipment. And then that institution collapsed in a fortnight for circumstances which I think we now understand rather better. That's not the first time that's happened to Western security force capacity building. We saw the same in Iraq not long ago. And of course, we said opium need to go, and as we've left Afghanistan, the crop thrives, $3 to $5 billion a year in profit, and our attempts to reduce it alienated many of the people we claimed to support. Otherwise, it went really well, we have to say that despite all this, there were many people who, and they weren't just soldiers, who were very brave, did good things, were creating an opportunity that we may in hindsight think the Afghans could have done more to exploit, but could not have done more. So now I'm going to turn to our panelists. I'm going to go in the order Christina, Tamim, Nick, and so asking them to speak for about 6 minutes or so. I'm going to try my luck and hope that Christina is on the line from Kabul. Christina.
Assalamu alaikum from Kabul. Excuse my strange garb, but this is now how we have to dress in Afghanistan as women. Even in my hotel, we are being told to dress like this because there's a Taliban commander staying there. And he told the hotel manager, we did not fight a jihad for 20 years so that foreign women could wander around with their heads uncovered. So now I'm just going to take it off because there's nobody else in this office. And tell you a little bit about what life is like in Kabul under the Taliban. I've been coming here for 33 years. I have never seen Kabul like this. There are Taliban everywhere. They all have guns. There's Taliban at my breakfast buffet with guns on their back. They're very polite to us for the most part. When we arrive as foreign journalists, we go to the Taliban Cultural Commission and they give us a special letter, which we carry around, and says that we must be allowed to do our work and not be interfered with. But there's already lots of signs of change here in Kabul. They've painted out all the murals, they've painted over the airport signs, they've painted over the embassy signs, all with their religious slogans congratulating Afghanistan on escaping from imperialism and the forces of imperialism. I thought I'd just give you a few impressions of different people that I've met here, just to give some sense of kind of how complicated it is, because it's easy to look from outside and think this is just an outrage and shocking, but not everybody feels like that. The Taliban obviously have not come from nowhere. They do have support from people. And for example, I just met a group of Taliban outside the house, one of those very blingy houses that Nick will remember, of a well-known warlord, and which they've now taken over. And those one of those Taliban was extremely well educated. He had a master's degree in engineering from a university here in Kabul. So I was asking him why he joined. And he said that a few years ago, while he was still a student, he was picked up by Afghan security forces out north of Kabul. And they held him for 2 months, and he had to pay $12,000 to get out of jail. And that made him very angry. So he decided to join them. And that just gives a sense of the sort of predatory government that there was here before. And you can't really underestimate the unpopularity of that government. And of course, the fact that it fled as the Taliban came to the outskirts of Kabul and supposedly fled with quite a lot of government money has really infuriated people. Most of the people that I know here in Kabul tend to be more educated people who, for the most part, have either fled or are particularly women. I just spoke to one of the first female governors in Afghanistan. There's only been 3, I think. And she's left the country, and she was saying to me how betrayed they feel that they were given hope by the West, and now it's all been taken away. And that's a really heartbreaking thing. You know, people, it's not that nothing happened in those 20 years. There were a lot of changes. It did become a different place, but almost overnight, that feels like it's gone. And in some ways, you know, you have to ask yourself, you know, would it have been better if we'd never come? But we've given people hopes that now they can't do anything with. They've been able to dream of a future that now they think they can never have. Of course, women are most affected by this because the Taliban have already said that women can't work because at the moment the security environment isn't conducive. Of course, that's what they said in 1996 when they took over before, and 5 years later it apparently still wasn't conducive. So at the moment, women are only being able to go to work in hospitals and schools. You saw the announcement of the Taliban government last night, which is basically 33 mullahs and not a single woman, and a lot of people that are on UN sanctions list, an interior minister who's wanted by the FBI. So, you know, the big question has been, has the Taliban changed? Is this different? And they clearly have a sort of charm offensive, the way that they have been treating foreign journalists and welcoming us into the country. But the fact is, when they announce a government like that, so hardline, not inclusive in any way, that seemed like a real sign that actually this is what they're really about. And when you kind of talk to, because many of the soldiers that have come here to Kabul have never been to Kabul before. They've come from lots of the provinces. And when you talk to them, particularly I think as a woman, all of them pretty much say that women shouldn't work, that they shouldn't be going out, that I shouldn't be wandering around. And what does my husband think about it? So it's a very bleak picture. And you may have seen that there's a bunch of brave women that have been coming out every day for about the last week on the streets, holding up placards saying, you know, give us our rights, that we're people too, we're half the country. And 3 or 4 times again today, those really small peaceful protests have been really brutally broken up by Taliban forces, and they've actually beaten some of the journalists covering it as well. And today they said that these protests are not allowed, that people have to have permission, and that they basically consider these to be riots. They're not riots, it's like 20 women holding up a placard. But, you know, and that is the only resistance really that is visible at the moment. I'm sure inside many people are resisting, but it's hard to see with the Taliban having taken control of the Panjshir this week, the last bit of the country that they didn't control, how at the moment they can be shifted. One last thing I should say, because I think this is really important, there are huge queues at banks here because most banks are closed. Banks are only allowing people to take a small amount of money. There's a big fear of a banking collapse. Lots of people on the streets are selling their clothes and household items because they have no other way of being able to buy food and bread. And so that is the most pressing situation really at the moment. How does this government or regime, which I noticed today has already started producing its own number plates for the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, but has no resources to pay wages, and doesn't really have the capability of, for the most part, of running a government. How is it going to actually be able to feed and service a nation of 38 million people? And are we heading here for a huge humanitarian crisis?
Christina, thank you very much. That's very sobering. Fair to say you're not doing anything for the holiday home market in Kabul just yet. Please stay with us, stay safe. We're now going to go to Tamim, and we'll come back to you for questions. So, Tamim.
Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Sir Barrons, for the opportunity. And let me thank also the Global Strategy Forum. It's a pleasure and an honor to be a part of this distinguished panel. Let me also, because I was evacuated, mention the bravery, dedication, and professionalism of the UK Armed Forces under very extreme, difficult circumstances, saved thousands of lives. And I think definitely us, but thousands of others owe gratitude to them. I would also like to thank the British veterans for their services for my country and for everything that they have done, including the British taxpayers. Now, I wanted to basically talk about three things. First was I tried to give you the Afghan perspective from my generation, which is the generation which was brought up in the last 20 years, studied via scholarships and went to different places, specifically on three aspects of this particular webinar. One is the lessons learned from an Afghan perspective. What were the lessons learned in the last 20 years? Why it happened? And what do we do now? Where we take it from here? I could jump and basically, I mean, there are many studies done, many sessions have been done on these particular topics. But on the first one, the top 5 or 6 lessons that many Afghans feel, at least my generation, is as follows. The first one is jumping from mission statement to mission statement, from objectives to objectives. It was never clear from the outset whether the international community came to get rid of terror safe havens, do nation building, or help Afghans, or just the allies were there because the United States were there because of Article 5. And that is why we got conflicting messages from different quarters of the coalition. The second lesson, which I think is very important to draw on, is the integration of levers of power and instruments of state power, and having an integrated approach between various agencies, and not relying only on the military function and on military to resolve everything. I think this integrated approach to the mission was not there, at least since 2007 and beyond. And therefore, that was an issue. And you have very well-placed, well-experienced people in the UK who this topic, I know, are very close to their heart, with a wealth of experience, such as Lieutenant General Giles Hill, who was there as deputy to General Miller, and many others who have been working on these particular issues. The third thing is this term which was coined called the forever wars. This was a farce, and this was a misnomer and a very misconceived terminology, because that is what I think triggered the fatigue and the scars of war of Afghanistan, because essentially what happened was when you're fighting ideologies, you have a evolving, persistent national security interest. So it's not the classical definition of a war where you have a beginning, middle, and end. Just like during the Cold War, when you were up against the Soviets and the communist ideology, it lasted for so long. So Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, essentially, they are an ideology that you're up for. The fourth thing is definition of winning. We never defined what winning is. And I think that is something that that was a big issue. Every time we won battles, but we never could win the war. And that is what we failed at, I think, also strategically. Corruption, of course, and misgovernance was a big issue on the Afghan side. You partnered with, I was out of the government 4 years ago, but one of the biggest issues we always stressed within the Afghan government was legitimacy, that you have to be legitimate in the eyes of the people, and whether it was from a military force, from a political aspect, or others. And I think we failed at that. The diversion of attention from in the middle of the Afghan campaign, from the Afghan war to the Iraq war, was a big problem, at least when Afghans in 2003, because in 2003-04, many of us felt this is a done deal, and we have won the war, and we will now build a state. And then all of a sudden, Iraq happened, and it diverted attention and resources, which I think backrolled all of the achievements, and that is when the attention and resources got back. Now, why it went wrong? The first one was the factors, of course, essentially building an army and a government in your own image, disregarding the Afghan realities and disregarding the Afghan culture was a major issue. And pumping so much money into a country and into a government which was not ready and didn't have the financial management capacity, which paved the way for corruption and for other mismanagements. The second thing was, obviously, this Afghan war was politicized, way politicized. The Afghan war was being fought by public opinion polls in the United States when there were elections. We could see that it was an electoral topic. I mean, why the Korean presence was never an electoral topic, or the U.S. presence in Japan, or allies' presence in Japan, or in other places where the United States and others have been there for years. And then I think on the factors, there was also a question of how we dealt with the PR and stratcoms. The stratcoms of the Afghan war was such an utter failure that we couldn't communicate to the Afghan people as well as to the region. Beyond 2004, the objectives as well as all of the good work that has been done when it comes to Afghanistan. Now, finally, what do we do now with all those major factors? First one is, and what is next for Afghanistan? I think the first thing is we really need to do a holistic assessment of the entire campaign, whether on diplomatic front, economic front, military front, and draw lessons learned. Some people compare Afghanistan's campaign to Russian campaign in Syria, or in other or Chinese presence in Africa. I think that's totally wrong. With all its flaws, the Afghan campaign also had lots of good things along with it. The alliance building, interoperability of allies in CT operations. But that if you compare it to the Russian army or to the Chinese army, they have never been in situations like that. That is why I don't think a Russian presence or a Chinese presence will ever be conceivable in the foreseeable future in Afghanistan. Now, what is next? Just briefly, for Afghanistan, I see a civil war looming and a humanitarian crisis, and a risk of being forgotten. For the region, they should expect spillover effects. Iran, Pakistan, and the wide India, Russia, Central Asia, they will see a resurgence of Islamist and jihadist groups and Salafist groups in their areas where they would like to replicate the victory of Taliban inside their own territories. You see the TTP resurgence inside Pakistan with recent attacks, and you also see the resurgence in Central Asia. There would be also a hike in drug trade and proxy wars. For the world, I think US and the West, the resurgent and emboldened threat of terrorism, damaged and bruised credibility, where many of your allies will start questioning you in terms of your credibility, which needs an standing in the world. And I mean, it really hurts me and it really bothers me, but I have to say this, that the possibility of another tragic 9/11 style attack is now more than ever possible, because many of these foreign fighters, which work under the umbrella of the Taliban, which are regional and global, including some European foreign fighters, they tend to hurt what they call as the far enemy, which is the Western interests. The near enemy, which are the Afghans and some of the regions, is really not their aim. Their ultimate goal is the far enemy. And of course, refugees, drug trade, and Taliban-inspired lone attacks is something that the West should be aware of and should take precautions. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't talked too much. Thank you.
Tamim, thank you so much. Very thought-provoking, and I think, like Christina, a little short on optimism we can identify. So we're now going to go for our third speaker, Nick Kay, who is with me here in the room. Nick.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Christina and Tamim, who have said it all. It won't stop me saying one or two things. And also just to acknowledge, I mean, the huge amount of wisdom that is in the virtual room, seeing the people who've signed up for this event. There are many, many people well placed, better placed than me to talk about Afghanistan. My exposure there, as you say, is UK ambassador, NATO senior civilian. I'll also add, just for the context, that I set up and headed the UK PRT in 2006-7 as well in Helmand, and also worked on Afghanistan in the mid-90s and had the dubious honor of being the first Western diplomat to meet the Taliban in Kandahar, and then again, first in Kabul in 96 after they arrived. And just to make everybody feel make me feel suitably old, I first visited Afghanistan in 1976 as well, 3 years before the Soviet Union visited. But that doesn't make me an expert. All it makes me deeply conscious of is how little I understand the country and how little I really know. Let me try to talk a little bit about, through a lens, a political military lens, I think, because my last assignment was as the NATO senior civilian, and that might be relevant to today's conversation. But before that, I mean, I have to admit right from the very start, and I've said it publicly many times, the shame that I feel. And as NATO ambassador, I always was very happy to receive the bouquets and the applause, and the Afghans and everybody else was always very generous at thanking us for everything we were doing, and I lapped it up. But now I think it behoves me also to put up my hand and say, you know, as ambassador, I said NATO will not abandon Afghanistan. I said NATO will defend the human rights and gains of the last 20 years. I said NATO will have an enduring partnership, security, support with Afghanistan. None of those have come to pass, and I feel deeply sorry and personally ashamed about that. So it's not going to add to the cheeriness of the conversation, Richard, at all, but looking back through the Pol Mill lens, let me just be slightly controversial or counterintuitive, though, and start actually looking back at what went well. And it is, you know, worth pausing, particularly through the NATO lens, the great historic importance and achievement of the Afghan campaign, the fact that Article 5 for the first time ever was implemented, and it led to the world's largest ever military alliance. That's not just NATO members, but partners as well. At its height, at least 45 nations in Afghanistan, in extraordinarily difficult, remote, out of theatre, the first NATO out of theatre operation to happen, and staged it for 20 years. Also, I think for NATO, the huge psychosocial value of that experience, let us not underestimate that hundreds of thousands of young men and women from across the alliance have had the experience of fighting together, living together, sometimes dying together, and the sense of working as an alliance for something that they all felt that mattered. I think, there is, a strengthening of the alliance from that experience. I think also NATO had some success in embedding values. There was a value of certainly promoting and defending human rights, but also civilian accountability, civilian leadership of the armed forces, etc. Tamim is an example of that. And I would also say that NATO managed to build an Afghan National Defence and Security Forces that bore the brunt of the fighting post-2014, took enormous casualties, but held the country for 4 or 5 years. So that's, just to, I'll turn now to what didn't go so well. And, the list is relatively familiar as well. There is a flip side of the ANDSF that was created as well, which wasn't well, and we have to learn lessons from that. As Tamim has said, it was, based on a model that was not sustainable, a very largely US model, very largely high-tech dependent on air cover and I-star assets, etc., which were not sustainable in the Afghan context. There was also throughout the whole engagement, again, as I think Tamim referred to, I think an overweening hubris from the alliance, false sort of pride of knowing best and imposing systems and methods which were not so appropriate. That also speaks to what Christina was saying about the antipathy built up in quite a lot of the population from the methods used by certain parts of the alliance during this, night raids, drone attacks, etc., and the partnering with some very, very disreputable forces during the campaign. So this built, questions there. You've mentioned as well corruption, and that is fundamental. Somebody mentioned Pakistan and the porous borders and the impacts of all of that as well. But I think, US unilateralism as well is a sort of learning point or lesson that we have to absorb now from this. I can certainly say from my experience on the ground that huge amounts of strength and huge amounts of valor and good intent from the US. However, their sharing gene was never their strongest gene in terms of consulting over the final withdrawal and indeed the final peace agreement with the Taliban that they made, virtually zero. So for the alliance, I think there will be now a need for reflection, as we've all said. I suspect that NATO will need to look at, does this now mean that they should focus more on Europe and the near neighborhood and less on such far-flung places? They will be looking, I think, at political military joint effects and how those are achieved. We talked about state building and things like that. There is this somehow misconception that state building is something we do to other places rather than something that we enable. There is also a misperception that it is somehow like an episode of DIY SOS or changing rooms or whatever. You just go in and, sort of with amount of effort over a crazy weekend, you can sort of turn something around. We didn't lose the war in Afghanistan. We lost our patience. We lost our will. There are two different things there. So I think, a lot for NATO to look at. I'm conscious of the time. Let me say also, where are we now and what's going to happen? Huge priority, I think, is still getting people out, and I'm very glad that the UK is committed to do that. I'll be even more glad when the Afghan civilian resettlement scheme is actually launched. At the moment, it isn't operational, despite having been announced. And so for all those Afghan vulnerable people back in Kabul or elsewhere, civil society, others who say we want to leave, at the moment, the website says, come back later. It's not operational, and that has to change. The Taliban, have they changed? I don't think so. I agree with Christina. Are they more savvy in terms of what they should be seen to be saying or heard saying? Yes, they are. The spectacular fault, I think, or possibly a strategic error they've made with their inclusive, non-inclusive government that they've announced yesterday. I think the attributes that serve them very well as an insurgency, single-minded determination, uncompromising in everything they did, particularly at the negotiating table, very good as an insurgency. There will be fatal flaws as a government of Afghanistan in particular, where the diversity of the country is its strength and its weakness as well. And that diversity needs to be reflected in the government in a way which it isn't at the moment. So I think they're going to struggle. Some things haven't changed. Economics are against them. Afghanistan has never been economically viable by itself, really, for the last 150 years. That will not change. Where is the money going to come from? I don't think the Taliban have an answer to that. Geography doesn't change either. Neighbors with a vested interest and an ability to cause trouble, that will not change either. So my long experience of Afghanistan tells me that if I look back over the 40 odd years that I've been one way or other involved, that there have been so many tumultuous changes, at least 3 major upheavals in that time. I don't think the future will be any different. And also, when I look back on those 40 years, the lesson I draw is you cannot ignore Afghanistan. You ignore it at your peril. It will come back one way or another to affect you. So for now, I say we should not repeat the mistakes of the 96. We should engage on the ground at a low-level diplomatic level, not recognizing the Taliban government, which is an unacceptable government at this stage, but having eyes and ears on the ground and mouths on the ground to support, advocate for human rights, for civil society, to oversee the safe passage of those who want to leave, and to engage on this enormous humanitarian challenge that is there and work through the UN on that. So I do hope that we will soon be able to re-engage in a very cautious and careful way. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you so much. An awful lot to digest there. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go to questions now. When you ask your questions or read them out, I will then single out one or more of our panel to tackle them first. And I'm delighted to say that first out of the blocks is Tobias Ellwood, the chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. So Tobias has 2 questions. The first one is, can the Taliban control the north of the country indefinitely? And I'm going to put that first to Tamim, and then I'm going to come to Christina in the hope that she has a view from her neighbours in the hotel about what they think. And the second part of his question is, and what should the UK be doing to help reinvigorate Western resolve to coordinate Western thinking, given the US seems to be stepping back? And I'm going to put that to Nick. So let's start with Tamim, and can the Taliban control the north of the country indefinitely?
Thank you. The answer is no. It's not their traditional geography, and the people in northern Afghanistan are from other ethnic groups. Plus, the geography there is extremely harsh with mountains and valleys. They're not used to that type of environment of fighting. The reason they got the northern Afghanistan at this time was primarily because of a lack of will on the part of the NDSF. Now the resistance is there. There are more local people who will be fighting. And with the announcement of the Taliban government yesterday, which was a disaster of all mullahs and almost 90% Pashtuns, the resistance will, and plus the resistance leaders, some of them who are now in Turkey, Now they will join hands, and I'm told they will announce soon in Tajikistan a shadow government. So I believe the real war will start now, and it will get very nasty for the Taliban. They have lost over 800 people, I'm told, in a 4 days battle only in Panjshir. So no, it's not their traditional stronghold. The resistance will get strengthened, and the only problem is now how to get humanitarian aid. And there are lots of former Mujahideen fighters who are now joining hands. And that is why the Taliban are so afraid, and that if they don't resolve the northern issue soon, they would have a civil war at their hand, just like in the 1990s, as Commander Massoud stood against them. So it's just a matter of time.
Thank you, Tamim. And Christina, what do the Taliban say with you?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with Tamim, because, I mean, one of the reasons that the Taliban were successful this time was a very clever strategy of starting with the north. The places they took first this time were the north, not their traditional strongholds in the south. They, working with Pakistan, have made a real effort over the last few years, which I think was not enough taken notice of, to make inroads into those places. And so actually, I don't see resistance being able to be built up very easily there. They have made strong inroads. And at the moment, a lot of the people from the past are very discredited. And it's a very different situation from Ahmad Shah Massoud in the past, when he controlled Panjshir, but he also controlled surrounding provinces like Badakhshan up to the border with Tajikistan, which enabled him to be able to, carry on fighting, to get supplies, logistics. The Taliban control everything at the moment, so it's going to be an incredibly uphill battle for any kind of resistance. And as I say, not least because a lot of these leaders are discredited by people. People are hopeless. They don't know who's turn to. They feel that most of the people that they thought were standing up for them have fled or not stood up for them. And so, it's not a hopeless situation. I don't see this ending well. I think there will be a humanitarian crisis, and I think there probably will be a civil war eventually, but not at the moment.
Thank you both. And so Nick, who I should say has just stepped down as a public servant, and so can unleash himself as to what the UK should be doing. Nick.
Yeah, no, thank you. I should have also prefaced my comments by saying, yes, I am no longer a public servant. So I'm speaking in entirely personal, private capacity. I think, first of all, there needs to be a degree of humility on our side, on our part, before we set about, preaching necessarily to others about what we should be doing or what has gone wrong. And that's a shared humility, but I think it, behoves us as the UK. I think also as a part of that process we've talked about before, there needs to be reviews. I would suggest that there should be 2 reviews. There should be a review of what's happened in this year, 2021, which is about largely, the operational aspects around the withdrawal and the handling of the evacuation, and a lot to be learnt from that. But that should be separated out from a review that looks at the whole 20-year campaign and draws some of the lessons which you were referring to yourself, Richard, and Tamim earlier. In NATO as well, obviously there needs to be a reflection process. How that will go and be structured, I don't know, but certainly some of the issues are to look at consultation and decision-making. The North Atlantic Council usually works best when some of the major powers have pre-discussed and agreed issues in smaller formats, and that was lacking, I think, in this case. So reviving that practice and looking at how decision-making can be done. Donor and humanitarian, I think, despite the UK's cuts to its overseas development assistance, it is still a major player in this sphere, and I hope we will be working very closely through the UN and supporting the UN conference next week to raise money for the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, to be funneled through UN agencies and NGOs, not through the government of Afghanistan. But again, going back to the sort of modesty that we need, we have to recognize that, the contact group that is most relevant for Afghanistan at the moment is not one where we are natural partners or members. It's more the Gulf countries, the neighbors, including China and potentially Russia. Now, none of those, I think you mentioned earlier, Richard, that they might provide the kind of money and aid that Afghanistan needs. Everything I have experienced over the last decades or whatever is not so. These are not donors. These are not generous payers, China or Russia. So, this economic crunch that the country faces, immediately the banking crisis, but well beyond that, just making the books balance, paying civil servants, paying teachers, paying doctors. This is going to be a horrendous challenge for the Taliban. And I think they are unfortunately ill-equipped. And one of the things they didn't include in their government is technocratic abilities.
Thank you to all our panel. We're going to go to the second question. It comes from Sir Tom Phillips, diplomat, well known, I think, to many of us. So he has two questions. And the first question is, could the speakers comment on the possible roles henceforth of external players, e.g. Pakistan and India? For example, will India support the resistance to the Taliban? But also Iran, China, Russia, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Will the regional lines of force foster continued conflict in Afghanistan, or will most players, the regional players, look to cut realpolitik deals with the Taliban? And I'm going to hold on the second question just for a moment, because that was complicated enough. And I'm going to start with Christina, and I'm then going to go to Tamim.
Let me just talk about Pakistan, because I was there before I came here. And I had a briefing with the most senior military in Pakistan before I came, and you probably saw the pictures of Pakistan's ISI chief arriving a few days ago here rather publicly, meeting with all the key players. So Pakistan is a really central player. I don't think I need to spell out to anybody there Pakistan's role in working with the Taliban over the years. But it was very noticeable in Islamabad and Rawalpindi last week that Pakistan finds itself in something of a quandary. They cannot hide their delight at having seen the West defeated and saying endlessly that we told you that you couldn't win this war militarily and you should have left a long time ago. But they're also extremely worried about what's going to happen because they are next door and they fear that there could be this massive humanitarian crisis, so lots of refugees will stream across the border. The border is currently closed because of COVID, so not many people are getting across. But as you probably know, there are still 3 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan from the time of the Soviet occupation, and they really feel that they can't host more. But they're also worried about the security situation, because this defeat of the West is a message to global jihadists everywhere that, the US forces have been defeated. Afghanistan is the place to be. It's very likely that a lot of bad guys will come in here. ISK, of course, are here. We've already seen senior Al-Qaeda figure coming back into Jalalabad. And so the situation in terms of counterterrorism, very worrying for the West, or possible using this as a base for terrorist attacks. But for Pakistan, which is next door, it's something really pressing. They're very worried. It was one of the issues that the ISI chief spoke about when he was here to them, that the Taliban released all the prisoners from Bagram and other places when they took over. And many of those people, or hundreds of them, were from the Pakistan Taliban, TTP, which is separate from the Afghan Taliban, but they have quite good relations. And it was TTP that caused all the terrorist attacks, mostly in Pakistan in the past, when Pakistan had more terrorist attacks than anywhere on earth. And so they fear that those guys will now go back across the border and cause them a huge problem. They also fear that the many jihadist groups, which frankly Pakistan's military helped encourage in the first place, are now very emboldened by this and might feel like, okay, we could do this in Pakistan. So, you know, it's a sort of double-edged sword for Pakistan, what has happened. But it was noticeable while I was there. Of course, Dominic Raab came there, the Prime Minister of Germany came. A lot of people are beating the door down to Pakistan now because they, as Nick said, I mean, the other people that have links with the Taliban, like China, Russia, Iran even, are not our natural allies. But so Pakistan is the sort of best hope for trying to engage with them in some way.
Christina, thank you. Tamim.
Thank you. Good to hear from Sir Tom Phillips. He was the one who encouraged me to do RCDS, so that's brilliant to hear from him. My experience working at the National Security Council at Defense, and then later on at my think tank, at our think tank at the IWPS, interacting with all sorts of regional ambassadors and visits, dozens of them. Here is how I see it. First, there is no alternative for the United States and NATO in the region. They don't have the money, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the will. Second, they have a very security-centric lens to Afghanistan. They don't think beyond their narrow groups that they are afraid of, who are working under the umbrella of the Taliban. For example, Chinese are concerned about ETIM. And over dozens of visits that I was a part of, the delegations we visited Beijing, that was their number one talking point. Same with the Russians. It's the terrorist groups that they're concerned about, plus the Chechens and the Americans at that time with all sorts of conspiracy theories. With the Iranians, the same, it was the Americans and NATO. But if we could put it pre-US, when US was there, now that the US is not there, the region at that time had one single objective, including the Pakistanis, which was to get rid of the United States. And they were, united in that, and they had different instruments that they were using it through their proxy warfare and through hybrid warfare and other means. Now that the United States is out, we see that the region is as divided as ever because they see a Pakistani friendly government installed there with no legitimacy in terms of whether elections or some sort of a means that they were elected. Now you see the Iranians actually voicing support for the resistance. You see the Indians today had a meeting with the Russians, or a series of meetings actually over the last 1 week. And then you also hear Central Asia, particularly Tajikistan, with the Russians. I fear that the Syrianization of Afghanistan could start, which is different regions playing different proxy games and supporting various proxy groups. But I don't see an alternative. The narratives we hear, for example, oh, China is going to come and take over Bagram Air Base, or China is going to come and invest $14 billion. The kind of narratives you hear from Pakistani politicians, for example, their interior minister yesterday or the day before mentioned something about $14 billion China is ready to invest. China's interest, for example, in Afghanistan, over many meetings that I interacted and others that I worked for interacted with them, was specifically boiled down to three things: ETIM, kill them, as many of them as you can, lists exchanged. Second is the security of their CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Third is their what they call the Western Corridor of the Belt and Road, which goes through Central Asia. And nothing more beyond that. If you calculate the entire Chinese foreign aid to Afghanistan, a lot of them were in kind. It doesn't go beyond $300 million, which was essentially one USAID project. The same goes with the Chinese. The same goes with the Iranians. The Russians never had an appetite at all. So, but what they are really interested is their traditional proxy fighting schemes, which they're really good at, and they've been doing it over many years. So I see a divided region who are hedging, and I see, sadly, that they are engaging in a proxy warfare, and they are not in one page. And there is no single country in the region, whether it's India or China or Russia, who would step up and take responsibility.
Tamim, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I fear we're out of time. We've covered an awful lot of ground in the hour that we have. There are 11 more questions in the queue. So I suspect during the course of this hour, we have become much better informed about Afghanistan, but I doubt that we've resolved very many of the issues that are out there and are going to run for weeks. So on behalf of the GSF membership, I'd like to thank our panel today, Christina, Tamim and Nick, for their contributions. I'd like to thank the membership for appearing and engaging, and we look forward to seeing all of you back on the 24th of September for our next webinar. Thank you all so very much.